Welcome to the last week of class. So last time we discussed urbanization and urban sprawl, the implications for congestion, pollution, and the suburbs. We also discussed plans and design ideas that are influenced by this idea of new urbanism. We also discussed economics and how it intersects with the environment. We discussed classical, neoclassical, and ecological economics. We also discussed how in the future, once resources like oil, for example, start to become scarce, that scarcity might push us forward to developing new technology and innovative ideas. This idea that scarcity leads to innovation in society. And then finally, we discussed alternative ways to rank the living situation in different countries, one of which is called the Genuine Progress Index. So this last lecture, it's fairly short, just heads up on that. It's about environmental policy and how we can make a difference. There's a table in your textbook that discusses the major US environmental laws that have been passed in recent living memory. So we have everything stretching back from the 1964 Wilderness Act that established the National Wilderness Preservation System that we enjoy here in the United States, all the way through some Superfund amendments of 1994. And we discussed what those Superfund sites were last week or the week before last, and how the increased funding to these Superfund sites help clean up hazardous waste. So please take a look at this table and be sure to understand what the legislation is and then the major provisions laid out in that legislation. So now we're going to watch a video that will help us understand environmental policy.
The environment is all around us, from the air we breathe, to the water we drink, to the ecosystems that we're a part of. But these natural resources weren't always protected in the United States. Detrimental impacts to the environment greatly increased in the early 1800s, when the Industrial Revolution intensified in the Americas. While the economy soared, environmental well-being began to plummet. This was due to population growth, as well as increases in the standard of living, which depleted natural resources. Factory outputs also increased air and water pollution and strengthened society's dependency on fossil fuels. This continued until 1962, when a single book helped the public understand how environmental impacts affected them personally. It was called Silent Spring, and it was written by a woman named Rachel Carson. In her book, she wrote about synthetic pesticides, especially one called DDT, and their adverse effects on the environment and human health. She is often credited for the start of the country's environmental movement. Within the same decade, legislators came together under Richard Nixon's administration and made a decision: let's protect our planet. The first mainstream environmental law was enacted in 1969, called the National Environmental Policy Act. It required groups to consider environmental impacts whenever they wanted to take on a new project, like building airports, highways, or military bases. The next year, the Environmental Protection Agency was founded. The agency was established to consolidate all of the federal government's environmental responsibilities. This includes researching pollutants, monitoring the environment, tracking environmental baselines, enforcing standards, and more. In the decades that followed, dozens of notable environmental laws were established. Three of the most well-known were the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act. After half a century, there are now more than 30 environmental laws or executive orders that the EPA administers, including some you may not know about that protect the world around you every day. These laws and orders cover everything, like beach cleanliness, chemical hazard safety, efficient energy production, pesticide residues, noise control, oil pollution, and more. To learn more about the environmental laws in our country, visit our website to explore our article about them. If you love learning about the environment as much as we do, subscribe to our Earth to Florida newsletter and follow us on social media.
All right, so that walked us through a little bit of the history of environmental policy and legislation here in the United States. And we often take for granted that nature and our environment is protected. It wasn't always the case. And so in order to maintain that protection that the provisions in these different legislative ordinances provide, we need to make sure that they're being implemented properly. So those laws that were in that table are among the most important environmental protections. But embedded in all of those laws, we have different actions that need to be taken at different levels, including the local level, the state level, and the national level. And these are practices and policies that have to be followed by citizens as well as industries. And all of this is negotiated by elected representatives who discuss and finally pass those rules that become laws. So environmental law can be established or modified in each of the three branches of government. Those elected representatives we talk about, they perform the legislative process. So they are in the legislative branch. But in addition to the legislative branch, we also have the judicial branch, which includes our federal judges and our Supreme Court, as well as the executive branch, which is the president, the vice president, his cabinet, and all of those federal governmental agencies that we'll get to talk about. So first, let's do a deeper dive into the legislative branch. The legislative branch establishes statutes or laws. So basically, the legislative branch, they legislate. These statutes are enacted by Congress, so they are passed by Congress and then signed by the president. So the way this works is you have to have both chambers of Congress pass a law. First, you have to get through the House of Representatives. There's one representative per each district in the United States. There's a whole heck of a lot of districts in the US. So we have 432 different state representatives in the House of Representatives. And then you get to the more senior body, the senators, and each state has two senators, a junior senator and a senior senator. And so therefore there's 50 states, meaning that there are 100 senators in Congress. Once a piece of legislation passes both chambers of Congress, then it gets signed by the president. The president has the authority to veto a piece of legislation that gets sent to their desk. However, that veto can be overridden with a supermajority in the Senate. So citizens can be involved in this process either by writing or calling or emailing their elected representatives. They can also go to town halls to voice their opinions on current pending legislation, or they can appear at public hearings. Every bill and all public laws are available for you to examine in full as part of the public record. So just because, you know, your favorite congressperson gets on the news and talks about what they don't like about the bill, recognize that you have the power and authority to look at the bill yourself and understand what is in that specific piece of legislation. And citizens can and should be involved in the legislative process by writing or calling their elected representatives. You can also visit their offices. I have a slide upcoming that shows you exactly how that works. But yeah, certainly get involved and become informed. It is so important. The next branch is the judicial branch, and they resolve disputes. So they have a number of different purposes. One of them is they want to decide or have the authority to decide the precise meaning of a law as it was written. Number two, they have to decide whether or not a law has been broken. Did a citizen or an industry violate that law in some way? Number three, whether the law itself breaks the Constitution or violates the Constitution in such a way that it is unconstitutional as a law. So unfortunately, interpretation is needed for a lot of these governmental statutes because they are written in such a way that they're pretty vague. They're kind of squishy, which, we don't really hear about all too often, but they're written in this vague way because it helps that piece of legislation gain passage through Congress. This is just how the system works. Don't ask me whether or not it is working correctly, but this is just how it is. And so when a law may have been broken, as is decided by a federal judge or a Supreme Court judge, it becomes a matter of criminal or civil law. So the US Supreme Court decides whether that law is consistent with the Constitution of the United States. And then this is where the US Supreme Court has a huge outsized role to play when it comes to legislation, especially environmental policy legislation, where the legislation may not be written as clear. And it also may contain verbiage and jargon that the Constitution itself doesn't directly speak to because the Constitution was written several hundred years ago. Finally, we have the executive branch. They direct the administrative law. There's more than 100 federal agencies and thousands of state and local boards and commissions that oversee environmental rules. The executive bodies, they set rules, they decide disputes, and they investigate misconduct. The EPA is included within the executive branch. The EPA, of course, is the Environmental Protection Agency, and they oversee and enforce public laws. They're the primary agency with the responsibility for protecting the environmental quality in the United States. And they actually are kind of pretty recent. They weren't created until 1970. They have right now more than 18,000 employees and 10 regional offices. So in addition to the EPA, there are other agencies that have profound environmental impacts on the United States. We also, in addition to the EPA, have the Department of the Interior, and they oversee public lands and national parks. So when you drive into the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, you might see a little emblem that says Department of the Interior. And that is because the Great Smoky Mountains National Park is a national park and therefore under the jurisdiction of the Department of the Interior, which is part of the executive branch. Next, we also have the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Agriculture operates more than 500 national wildlife refuges, and they administer the Endangered Species Act. So the Department of Agriculture is home to the U.S. Forest Service. So the Forest Service and the Department of the Interior are completely separate entities, but all of them are in the executive branch. The executive branch, of course, is headed by the President of the United States at the federal level. But at the state level, the executive branch is headed by the governor of that state. Now, within each state, there are various agencies, boards, and commissions that oversee environmental policies. These bodies set rules, they decide disputes and investigate misconduct. And at the federal level, they can have far-reaching consequences. These executive rules that can be made quickly and with little insight or contribution from Congress or the general public. And so when we have a turnover of administrations, particularly when we go from one party to another back to back, there's a lot of switching of rules and priorities that can happen. So for example, President Clinton's administration in the 90s, they established rules protecting 58 million acres of roadless wilderness from being logged and torn down and developed. Okay, so that was a priority for President Clinton in the 90s. But when President Bush was elected president, he quickly reversed those rules after his election. And so he opened up those roadless acres to development, logging, this, that, and the other thing. So after the Bush years, then we elected President Obama, and the Obama administration then overturned the Bush rules, thereby imposing new protections on those roadless wilderness areas. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of flip-flopping that happens when we're talking about environmental policies and things that are or are not protected at the federal level. So this is just the executive branch. But as you can imagine, there are interconnected pieces and interactions between the different branches that can maybe be at odds with the goals of the current administration. And so there is a link to a podcast called the Energy Policy Now podcast that was released on April 6th, 2021. And they point to the new composition of the Supreme Court and how that conservative supermajority might stand in the way of some of the climate action that the new Biden administration might have in store. So they asked the question, how big a threat is the Supreme Court to Biden's climate agenda? Please listen to this podcast. It's about 48 minutes long. So that's why this lecture is going to be a little bit shorter. I wanted you to have the time to listen to this, but please pay close attention to the constant moving parts and how the Supreme Court and rulings that they make could potentially stand in the way of some of these climate actions that the new Biden administration is trying to enact. So the perennial question, of course, is how much government do we want? How much government in the United States do Americans need? So President Ronald Reagan, in his 1981 inaugural address, he famously said that government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. So in this, he invoked a perennial debate in American politics that you probably are aware of. Is government a power that undermines personal liberties and freedoms? Or is the government a defender, a protector of those liberties and rights and the common good? So this is something that is constantly being debated all of the time. And there are merits to both views. On one side, you have what is known as rugged individualism. You may have heard that term before. It's pulling yourself up from your bootstraps and not relying on governmental handouts or welfare programs to help you achieve your goals. And then you have on the other side, those that have the ideology in which they value a centralized system of governance that promotes public health, public safety, public education, and public welfare. Okay, so some Americans value that self-reliance and rugged individualism ideology. So on the surface, rugged individualism, it sounds laudable, it sounds praiseworthy. You're doing what you can and making your life better. But what this ideology of self-reliance and rugged individualism fails to take into account is the systems in place that privilege some individuals to pick themselves up from their bootstraps while ignoring or standing in the way of other individuals from doing the same thing. Okay, so it's all about your station in life and how the system at large allows you to be that rugged individual. Okay, so that's on one side. On the other side, when you have an acknowledgement of the importance of a centralized system of governance, you want someone to protect us from contaminated food and drugs. So you want the FDA, you want someone to educate your children. So you want a really good Secretary of Education in the executive branch. And you want someone, the government, hopefully, to take your tax dollars and turn them into really good roads and safe bridges and safe drinking water and safe air. But part of the reason why these disputes persist maybe that, of course, they are partially correct. And you should ask yourself, what factors influence your views? on these issues. There's a famous quote by a lobbyist, Grover Norquist, and he was a well-known proponent of the small government strategy. And he was known to say that my goal is to cut government in half in 25 years to get it down to the size where we can drown it in a bathtub. So that's all the way on one side of the spectrum, okay? But moving on from that, let's bring this back to something that we've already discussed and learned about called the precautionary principle. So the precautionary principle states that when an activity threatens to harm health or the environment, we should fully understand the risks before initiating that activity. Okay, and so this idea of, should we be better safe than sorry? Who is going to be the regulatory agency, if not the government, to let us know what is safe versus unsafe or potentially harmful? The European Union has adopted this precautionary principle idea as the basis for their environmental policy. And we learned about this in A Terrible Thing to Waste with Harriet A. Washington. And so here is just a cartoon where, someone who is creating oil or drilling up oil says there's no danger here, and the precautionary principle would ask them to stop and please prove that there is no harm being done to the environment through those actions. So in the US, the main opposition to the precautionary principle stems to those who claim that productivity and innovation are going to be stifled or pushed down or limited or stopped if we adopt this precautionary principle. There are a couple of tenets that we need to enact if we're going to fully adopt the precautionary principle. There are 4 of them. So number 1, people have a duty to take steps to prevent harm. If you suspect something bad might happen, you have an obligation to stop it. Number 2, the burden of proof of carelessness of a new technology, process, activity, or chemical lies with the proponents. So those pushing it forward that want to take it to market. The burden of proof to show that it is not a harm to the environment lies with those individuals, not with the general public. Number 3, before using a new technology, process, chemical, or starting a new activity, people have an obligation to examine a full range of alternatives, including the alternative of not using it. And then finally, decisions using the precautionary principle must be open and democratic and must include the affected parties. This is a very big deal. And so, those with more of a libertarian ideology, as long as no one's harmed, everything's fine. Oftentimes, those who are harmed the most or suffer the most from an activity or new technology or process are those who do not have a voice to say that they are being harmed. Okay, so the next time that you see somebody say, oh, well, nobody's harmed by it, so it's fine. Think about who has the largest megaphone and the bully pulpit to say that no harm is being done. So what is the highest priority when we're talking about environmental policy, environmental laws? We need to address the problem, not simply the symptoms of the problem. Throughout this course, we have discussed and focused mainly on the symptoms of problems. Okay, so dirty water, inhospitable living conditions. Those are the symptoms of a larger problem that we have to address with our environmental policies and statutes. So what are the real problems? The real problems, number 1, we're faced with greed. In the United States in particular, we have a capitalistic society where capitalistic values are placed at the highest priority. And oftentimes, in order to attain those capitalistic goals, we make sacrifices amongst our communities and amongst our environment. And so greed is one of the real problems. But number two, the flip side to that is waste, especially by consumers who are spoiled in the communities that we live in and the lifestyles that we have to say, oh, I'll just get another one if this thing breaks. We don't share the thought process maybe of several generations ago, where if something were to break, we would do all we can to fix that thing because it was precious. It was all that we had. But now in days where you can just order stuff on the internet and have it shipped to your house in 2 days, you are more likely to be wasteful in your mindset. Another real problem is overpopulation, especially in areas where you are accustomed to a more affluent lifestyle and you require more resources to be dedicated to a single individual compared to another country where it doesn't take as many resources to support that individual. We also have ignorance, not being aware of the problem because it's not occurring in your backyard. You think that you are not truly affected by these problems because you don't see them in your face day in and day out. And so ignorance, or maybe even willful ignorance, is a real problem. And then finally, also distraction. This is a huge issue, especially when we're talking about climate mitigation policies and policy makers, those legislators on Capitol Hill that want to distract us from the main problems. They claim that jobs are going to be lost if we impose all of these environmental regulations. We're going to stifle job creation and innovation and development. As we mentioned in a couple of lectures ago, that's actually not true. Layoffs related to environmental regulations are maybe 0.1% in this country. In fact, developing new, cleaner, renewable sources of energy is going to bring a job surplus, a boom to jobs in our economy here in the United States. So this is just a distraction.